The Hardy Boys, The House on the Cliff, Chapter 5, Pretzel Pete. "Just a minute," Miss Harper said to her sons. "Well, how about supper?" "We can eat when we come back from our interview with Jones," Joe answered. "Mother, he may decide to leave the farmhouse any time." Despairingly, Miss Hardy returned to her husband. "What do you think, Fenton?" The detective gave his wife an understanding smile, then turned to Frank and Joe. "Didn't you say Jones was in pretty bad shape?" "Yes, Dad," Frank replied. "Then I doubt very much that he'll try to leave the Kanes' home before the time he's set tomorrow morning. I'm sure that it'll be safe for us to eat Mother's good supper and still see our man in time." Joe subsided, and to make his mother feel better, he said with a smile, "Guess I'll let this mystery go to my brain for a minute. As a matter of fact, I have an empty space inside of me big enough to eat 2 suppers. Miss Hardy tweaked an ear of her energetic son, just as she had frequently done ever since he was a small boy. He smiled at her affectionately, then asked what he could do to help with supper. "Well, suppose you fill the water glasses and get milk for you and Frank," Miss Hardy said, as she and Joe went downstairs together. At the table, as often happened at meals in the Hardy home, the conversation revolved around the mystery. Frank asked his father if he had made any progress on his part in the case concerning the smugglers. "Very little," the detective replied. "Snapman is a slippery individual. He covers his tracks well. I did find out, though, the law firm which is handling the old Mr. Pollitt's affairs has had no luck in locating the nephew to whom the property was left." "Mr. Kane said he'd heard Mr. Pollitt call his nephew a no-good," Frank put in. "That's just the point," Mr. Hardy said. "The lawyers learned from the police that he's a hoodlum and is wanted for burglary." Frank whistled. "That puts the nephew in a bad spot, doesn't it? If he showed up to claim the property, he'll be nabbed as a criminal." "Exactly," Mr. Hardy answered. "What will become of the property?" Joe queried. His father said that he thought the executors might let the house remain vacant, or they might possibly rent it. They could do this on a monthly basis. This would give added income to the estate. "Which wouldn't do the nephew good if he went to jail," Miss Hardy put in. "That would depend on how long his sentence was," her husband said. "He may not be a dangerous criminal. He may just have fallen into bad company and unwittingly become an accessory in some hold-up or burglary." "In that case," Frank remarked, "he may realize that he wouldn't have to stay in prison long. He may appear to claim the property, take his punishment, and then lead a normal, law-abiding life out in his uncle's place." "Well, I sincerely hope so," Mr. Hardy replied. "The trouble is, so often when a young man joins a group of hoodlums or racketeers, he is blackmailed for the rest of his life, even though he tries to go straight." The detective smiled. "The best way to avoid such a situation is to never get into it." At this moment the phone rang, and Frank went to answer it. "It's for you, Dad," he called, coming back to the table. Mr. Hardy spent nearly 15 minutes in conversation with the caller. In the meantime, the boys and Miss Hardy finished their supper. Then, while Mr. Hardy ate the dessert, he told his family a little about the information he had just received on the phone. "More drugs have disappeared," he said tensely. "I'm positive now that Snapman is behind all of this." "Were the drugs stolen around here?" Frank asked. "We don't know," his father answered. "A pharmaceutical house in the Midwest was expecting a shipment of rare drugs from India. When the package arrived, only half the order was there. It was evident that someone had cleverly opened the package, removed part of the shipment, and replaced the wrapping so neatly that neither the custom officials nor the post office was aware that the package had been tampered with." "How were the drugs sent to this country?" Joe queried. "They came by ship." "To which port?" "New York, but the ship did not stop at Bayport." "And how long ago was this?" "Well, nearly 2 months ago. It seemed that the pharmaceutical house wasn't ready to use the drugs until now, so they hadn't opened the package. Then, said Joe, the drugs could have been removed right on the premises and have had nothing to do with the smugglers. You're right, Mr. Hardy agreed. Each time drugs are reported missing, there's a new angle to the case, although I'm convinced Snapman is back of it. How to prove this is really the stickler. Mr. Hardy went on to say that the tip he had received about Snapman being in the Bayport area had been a very reliable one. He smiled. I'll tell you all a little secret. I have a very good friend down at the waterfront. He picks up many kinds of information for me. His name is Pretzel Pete. Pretzel Pete? Frank and Joe cried out. What a name! That's a nickname along the waterfront, Mr. Hardy told them. He laughed. During the past few years, I've munched on so many of the pretzels he sells, I think I'm his best customer. By this time the boy's father had finished his dessert, and he suggested they leave at once for the Kane farmhouse. He brought his black sedan from the garage, and the boys hopped in. It did not take long to cover the 6 miles to the place where Jones was spending the night. Why, the house is dark, Frank remarked, puzzled. Maybe everyone's asleep, Joe suggested. This early? Frank protested. Mr. Hardy continued down the lane. There was no sign of anyone around the place. Frank remarked that perhaps the farmer and his wife had gone out of the evening. But I'm surprised that they would leave Jones alone in this condition, he added. I'm quite sure they wouldn't, his father answered. If they're asleep, I'm afraid we'll have to wake them. He pulled up in front of the kitchen entrance. Frank was out of the car in an instant. The other followed. He rapped on the door. There was no answer. Let's try the front door, Joe suggested. Maybe that has a knocker on it. The boys walked around on the ocean side of the house. Although they banged loudly with the brass door knocker, there was still no response. The Kanes must have gone out, said Joe. But what about Jones? Surely he is here. I'm too weak to come to the door, Frank surmised. But he could call out. I can't understand it. The brothers returned to the back door and reported to their father. Then, as Joe rapped several more times without response, a sinking feeling came over the brothers. I guess Jones recovered fast and has gone, Joe said dejectedly. We've goofed. Tie the knob. The door may not be locked, Mr. Hardy ordered. From his tone, the boys knew that he shared their fears. Frank turned the knob and the door swung open. Mr. Hardy felt around for a light switch on the wall. Well, we go in, he murmured. If Jones is here, we talk to him. By this time the detective had found the switch. As the kitchen became flooded with light, the boys gasped, thunderstruck. On their previous visit they had been impressed by the neatness of the room. Now the place looked as though an earthquake had shaken it. Pots and pans were scattered around the floor. The table was overturned. A chair lay upside down in a corner. Shattered bits of cups and saucers were strewn on the floor. What happened? Frank exclaimed in bewilderment. There had been a fight or a struggle of some kind, said Mr. Hardy. Let's see what the rest of the house looks like. The boys opened the door to the adjoining living room. Frank snapped on the wall switch. They were horrified at the sight met by the Hardys' eyes. The farmer and his wife, bound and gagged, were tied to chairs in the middle of the room. Swiftly, Frank, Joe, and their father rushed over to Mr. and Mrs. Kane. They had been tied with strong ropes and so well gagged that the couple had been unable to utter a sound. In a minute the Hardys had loosened the bonds and removed the gags. "Thank goodness!" Miss Kane exclaimed with a sigh of relief, stretching her arms. Her husband, spluttering with rage, rose from his chair and hurled the ropes on the side. "Those scoundrels!" he cried out. Frank hastily introduced his father and asked, "What happened?" For several moments Mr. and Mrs. Kane were too upset to tell the story, but finally the farmer staggered over to the window and pointed down the shore road. "They went that way," he roared. "Follow them." "Who?" "Just the thugs who tied us up. They took Jones." Chapter 6. The Strange Message. "How long ago did those kidnappers leave?" Frank asked the Kanes quickly. "About 10 minutes," replied the farmer. "Maybe you can catch them if you hurry." "Come on, Dad," Frank cried. "Let's go after them." Mr. Hardy needed no further urging. He and his sons ran out of the house and jumped into the car. "That's rough stuff," Joe said to his father as they turned onto the shore road. "Barging into a house, tying up the owners and kidnapping a guy." "Yes," Mr. Hardy agreed. It looks as though your friend Jones is mixed up in some kind of racket. Those men must have been pretty desperate to risk breaking into an occupied house." The boy's father was able to follow the tracks of the car from the tread marks in the dusty road. But soon there were signs that another car had turned into the shore road from a side lane, and the trail became confused. The Hardys passed the lane that led into the Pollitt place and continued on until they came to a hilltop. Here they could get a clear view of the road winding along the coast for several miles. There was no sign of a car. "Well, we've lost them, I guess," said Frank in disappointment as Mr. Hardy brought the sedan to a stop. "They had too much of a head start," Joe remarked. "If only we'd gotten to the farm sooner. Well, we may as well go back." Mr. Hardy agreed, turned the car around, and once more the Hardys headed for the farm. On the way they discussed the mysterious kidnapping and speculated on the identity of those responsible. "I'll bet those men in the other motorboat saw us rescue Jones, or else they heard somehow that they had been taken to the farmhouse," Joe surmised. "If they are the kidnappers, I wonder what will happen to Jones now," Frank said gravely. "They tried to kill him once." "Maybe they'll just hold him prisoner," Mr. Hardy stated thoughtfully. "They were probably afraid that he'd tell all he knew and couldn't afford to leave him at the farmhouse." When they got back to the Kanes, they found the farmer and his wife somewhat recovered from their harrowing experience. Miss Kane was busy straightening up the kitchen. "We couldn't catch them," Frank reported sadly. "Well, those hoodlums had a high-powered car and they weren't wasting any time. I could see them from the windows as they went down the lane," the farmer remarked, frowning angrily at recollection. "Please tell us exactly what happened, Mr. Kane," Joe urged. "Well, Mabel and I were here in the kitchen," the man began. "Mabel was washing the supper dishes when this fellow came through the door. He was a tall chap with a long, thin face. He asked us if we were looking after the man that was almost drowned earlier," the farmer's wife took up the tale. "When we said we were, the fellow told us that Mr. Jones was his brother, and he had come to take him away. I got suspicious," Mr. Kane broke in. "He didn't look nothing like Jones. I asked him where he lived. At that," Miss Kane added, "he walked in the house with another fellow right at his heels. They grabbed my husband. Henry put up an awful good fight, but he was outnumbered. When I tried to help, a third man appeared from nowhere, and he held me back. They dragged us into the living room, tied us to those chairs, and put the gags in our mouths," the farmer continued. "Then we heard them going into Jones' room. Pretty soon they carried him out to a car where a fourth fellow was sitting at the wheel." "Did Jones put up a fight when they took him away?" Frank asked. "He tried to. He hollered for help, but of course I couldn't do anything, and he was too weak to struggle much." "This whole affair is very peculiar," Mr. Hardy observed. "Perhaps Jones is mixed up in the struggling going on around here. But who were those 4 men, I wonder?" Miss Kane shook her head. "All I know is we're sure glad you and your sons came tonight. There's no telling how long we'd have been tied up before somebody found us." "We are glad, too, that we got here," Frank replied. "You folks say your name is Hardy," said the farmer. "Any relation to Fenton Hardy?" "Well, right here," the detective smiled. "Pleasure to know you," exclaimed Kane heartily, putting out his hand. "If anyone can get to the bottom of this business, you can." "I certainly try," the boy's father promised. The Hardys bade the farmer and his wife good-bye. They promised to call again at the Kane farm as soon as they had any further information, and Mr. Kane in turn said he would notify them if he found any trace of Jones or his kidnappers. When they returned home, the boys followed their father into his study. "What do you make of all this, Dad?" Joe asked. Mr. Hardy sat down at his desk. He closed his eyes, leaning back in his chair in a few moments without speaking. "I have only one theory," he said at last. "The kidnappers probably are Snapman's friends. That means you boys may have uncovered the fact that there is a whole gang of smugglers around here." The brothers were pleased with their progress. "What do we do next, Dad?" Joe asked eagerly. "I want to evaluate the case from every angle," the father replied. "I'll think about it and talk to you later." With this, the boys had to be content for the rest of the weekend. When the brothers came downstairs Monday morning, Miss Hardy was putting their breakfast on the table. In answer to the boys' inquiries, she replied, "Your father went out early this morning in his car. He didn't say when he would return, but your dad didn't take a bag with him, so he'll probably be back today." Miss Hardy was accustomed to her husband's comings and goings at odd hours in connection with his profession, and she had learned not to ask questions. Frank and Joe were disappointed. They had looked forward to resuming a discussion of the case with their father. "I guess we're left out on our own again to try to find something about those smugglers," Frank remarked, and Joe agreed. Later, when they reached Bayport High School, the brothers saw Yola Moulton standing on the front steps. With pretty dark-haired Yola was her best friend Kelly Shaw. Kelly, a blonde, vivacious, brown-eyed girl, was Frank's favorite among all the girls in his class. "How are the ghost hunters this morning?" she asked with a mischievous smile. "Yola told me about your adventures on Saturday." "Chet was really scared," Yola chimed in. "I think somebody played a good joke on all of you." "Well, whoever it was had better return the telescope eyepieces on our motorcycle tools," Joe said defiantly. But as the day wore on and none of their classmates teased them or brought up the subject, the Hardys became convinced that the ghost had been serious and not just playing pranks. "It was no joke," Joe said to Frank on the way home. "If any of the fellows at school had done it, they'd be kidding us plenty by now." "Right," Frank agreed. "Joe, do you think the smugglers had anything to do with what happened at the Pollard place?" "That's a sword!" exclaimed Joe. "That house on the cliff would be a great hideout. If the smugglers could make a house appear to be haunted, everyone would stay away." "I wish Dad would get home so we could take up his idea with him," Frank said thoughtfully. But Mr. Hardy did not come that day. He had often been away for varying lengths of time without sending word, but on this occasion, since he had not taken the bag, the boys felt uneasy. "Let's not worry Mother about this," Frank said, "but if Dad is not back at Wednesday, the latest, I think we should do some inquiring. Maybe Pretzel Pete will be able to help us." Joe agreed. Wednesday was the start of their summer vacation, and they could give full time by tracking to locate their father. On Tuesday afternoon, the mystery of Mr. Hardy's absence took a strange turn. Frank and Joe came home from school to find their mother seated in the living room, carefully examining a note that she had evidently just received. "Come here, boys," Miss Hardy said in an apprehensive tone. "Look at this, and tell me what you think." She handed the note to Frank. "What is it?" he asked quickly. "Word from Dad?" "It's supposed to be." The boys read the note. It was typed on a torn sheet of paper, and the signature looked like Fenton Hardy's. It read, "I won't be home for several days. Don't worry, Fenton." That was all. There was nothing to indicate where the detective was, nothing to show when the note had been written. "When did you get this, Mother?" asked Frank. "It came in the afternoon mail. It was addressed to me, and the envelope had a Bayport postmark." "Why are you worried?" Joe asked. "At least we've heard from Dad." "But I'm not sure he sent the note." "What do you mean?" "Your father and I have an agreement. Whenever he writes me, he puts a secret sign beneath his signature. Fenton was always afraid that someone would forge his name to a letter or note and perhaps get papers or information that he shouldn't have. Frank picked up the note again. There is no sign here, just Dad's signature. It may be his signature. If not, it's a very good forgery. Miss Hardy was plainly worried. If Dad didn't write this note, Joe asked, who did and why? Your father has many enemies, criminals whom he had been instrumental in sending to prison. If there has been foul play, the note might have been sent to keep us from being suspicious and delay any search. Foul play! Exclaimed Frank in alarm. Then you think something has happened to Dad? Chapter 7. The Hidden Trail. Joe put an arm around his mother. Frank and I will start searching for Dad the first thing tomorrow, her son said assuringly. Next morning, as the boys were dressing, Joe asked, "Where shall we start, Frank?" "Down at the waterfront. Let's try to find Pretzel Pete and ask him if Dad talked to him on Monday. He may give us a lead." "Good idea." The boys reached the Bayport Waterfront early. It was the scene of great activity. A tanker was unloading barrels of oil. Longshoremen were trundling them to waiting trucks. At another dock, a passenger ship was tied up. Porters hurried about, carrying luggage and packages to a line of taxicabs. Many sailors strolled along the busy street. Some stepped into restaurants, others into amusement galleries. "I wonder where Pretzel Pete is," Frank mused. He and Joe had walked 4 blocks without catching sight of the man. "Maybe he's not wearing his uniform," Joe surmised. "You know, the one Dad described." "Let's turn and go back the other way beyond the tanker," Frank suggested. The boys reversed their direction and made their way through the milling throng for 6 more blocks. Suddenly Joe chuckled. "Here comes our man." Strolling towards them, and talking the product he had for sale, came a comical-looking individual. He wore a white cotton suit with a very loose-fitting coat. Around his neck was a vivid red silk handkerchief embroidered with anchors. The vendor's trouser had been narrowed at the cuff with bicycle clips to keep them from trailing on the ground, with the result that there was a continuous series of wrinkles from the edge of his coat to his ankles. The man wore a white hat which had come down on his ears. On the white-brown band the name Pretzel Pete was embroidered in white letters. "Boy, that's some gear," Frank murmured. Pretzel Pete's garb was bizarre, but he had an open, honest face. He stopped calling pretzels, hot pretzels, best in the land, and smiled at the Hardys. He set down the large metal food warmer he carried. From the top of it rose 3 short aerials, each ringed with a dozen pretzels. "You like them hot, or do you prefer them cold?" he asked the brothers. Joe grinned. "If they are good, I eat them anyway." Then he whispered, "We are Mr. Fenton Hardy's son. We'd like to talk to you." At that moment a group of sailors brushed past. Pretzel Pete did not reply until they were out of earshot. Then he said to the boys, "Come into this warehouse." The brothers followed him down the street at a short distance and through a doorway into an enormous room, which at the moment was practically empty. "You brought a message from your pop?" the vendor asked. Quickly Frank explained to him that their father seemed to be missing. "We thought you might have heard this." "Yes, I did," Pretzel Pete answered, "but I didn't think nothing about it. I always thought detectives disappeared, sometimes in order to fool people they were after." "They sometimes do," Joe told him, "but this time it seems to be different. Dad said often he came down here to get information from you, because you always give him good tips, and he wondered if you had seen him lately." "Yes." "When?" "Monday morning." "Dad has been gone ever since." The man frowned, picked up a pretzel from one of the aerials, and began to munch on it. "Help yourself, fellows." Frank and Joe each took one of the pretzels. They had just bitten into the delicious salted rings when Pete continued. Now you got me worried. Your pop's a fine man, and I wouldn't want to see anything happen to him. I'll tell you a place you might look for him. Pretzel Pete said that he had picked up a bit of information that led him to think an East Indian sailor named Ali Singh might be engaged in some smuggling. The vendor did not know what ship he sailed on, but he understood that the man had come ashore for secret meeting of some gang. This here meeting, Pretzel Pete explained, was being held out in the country, somewhere off the shore road. It was to be in a deserted farmhouse on Hillcrest, something or other. I don't remember whether it was road or street or what. Was this last Monday? Frank asked eagerly. Oh, no, the vendor answered. This was about 3 weeks ago. When I told your pop, he seemed real interested, that he'd guessed he'd go out there and look around. Joe broke in. Dad must have brought the rest of the gang. He might be living there. Maybe they're holding him a prisoner. Oh, I hope not, Pretzel Pete said worriedly. But you fellows better get right out there and take a look. We certainly will, Frank told the man. The brothers thanked Pretzel Pete for the information, then hurried home. Miss Hardy was not there. They did not have a chance to tell her about their plans. We'll leave a note, Frank decided, and quickly wrote one. Their hopes high, the brothers set off on their motorcycles on the search for their father. By now they were very familiar with the shore road, but did not recall having seen any sign reading Hillcrest. Suppose it's not marked, said Joe. We'll never find it. Frank gripped his handlebars hard. If Dad found it, we won't give up until we do. The motorcycles chugged past side road after side road. The farther away from Bayport the boys went, the farther apart these roads became. After a while they came to the Kane's farmhouse and were tempted to stop and see if they might know where Hillcrest was. But just then, a short distance ahead, Joe saw a small car suddenly turn into the shore road. It seemed to have come right out of a clump of bushes and trees. Come on, Frank, let's investigate that place. The boys pushed ahead, hoping to speak to the driver of the car. But he shot down the road in the opposite direction at terrific speed. When Frank and Joe reached the place from which they had just emerged, they saw that it was a road, though hardly noticeable to anyone passing by. I'll take a look to see where that goes, Frank said, shutting off his motorcycle and walking up the grassy, rutted lane. Suddenly he called back. We're in luck, Joe. I see a homemade sign on a tree. It says Hillcrest Road. Frank returned to his brother, and the boys trundled their machines up among the trees to hide them. Then they set off afoot along the almost impassable woods road. There aren't any tire tracks, Joe remarked. I guess that fellow who drove out must have left his car down at the entrance. Frank nodded, and then in a low tone suggested that they approach the deserted farmhouse very quietly in case members of the gang were there. In fact, I think it might be better if we didn't stay on this road, but went through the woods. Joe agreed, and silently the Hardys picked the way along among the trees and through the undergrowth. 5 minutes later they came to a clearing in which stood a ramshackle farmhouse. It looked as if it had been abandoned for many years. The young Floyces stood motionless, observing the run-down building intently. There was not a sound of activity either inside or outside the place. After the boys had waited several minutes, Frank decided to find out whether or not anyone was around. Picking up a large stone, he heaved it with precision aim at the front door. It struck with a resounding thud and dropped to the floor of the sagging porch. Frank's action brought no response, and finally he said to Joe, I guess nobody's home. Let's look in. Right, Joe agreed. And if Dad's a prisoner there, we will rescue him. The boys walked across the clearing. There was no lock on the door, so they opened it and went inside. The place consisted of only 4 first-floor rooms. All were empty. A tiny cellar and a loft with a trapdoor reached by a ladder, also proved to have no one in them. I don't know whether to be glad or sorry Dad's not here. It could mean he escaped from the gang if he was caught by them and is safely in hiding, but can't send any word to us. Or it could mean he's still a captive somewhere else, Joel said. Let's look around here for clues. The boys made a systematic search of the place. They found only one item which might prove to be helpful. It was a torn piece of Turkish towel on which the word polo appeared. This could have come from the country club where they play polo, Frank figured, or some stable where polo ponies are kept, Joe suggested. Puzzled, Frank put the scrap in his pocket, and the brothers walked down Hillcrest Road. They brought their motorcycles from behind the trees and climbed the broad. What do you think we should do next? Joe asked. Well, see Police Chief Collick in Bayport, Frank replied. I think we should show him this towel. Maybe he can identify it. Half an hour later they were seated in the chief's office. The tall, burly man took a great interest in the Hardy boys and often worked with Fenton Hardy on his cases. Now Chief Collick gazed at the scrap of toweling for a full minute, then slapped his desk. I have it! That is a piece of the towel from the Marco Polo. What's that? A passenger ship that ties up here once in a while. Frank and Joe actually jumped in their chairs. Their thoughts went racing to L.A. Singh, smugglers, the gang, at the deserted farmhouse. At that moment, Chief Collick's phone rang. The Hardys waited politely as he answered, hoping to discuss these new developments with him. But suddenly he put down the instrument, jumped up and said, Emergency, fellows! I have to leave right away. With that, he rushed out of his office. Frank and Joe arose disappointedly and left the headquarters. Returning home, they reported everything to their mother, but upon seeing how forlorn she looked, Frank said hopefully, that note you received with Dad's name on, it could have been on the level. Miss Hardy shook her head. Fenton wouldn't forget the secret sign. I just know he wouldn't. Word quickly spread through Bayport that the famous Fenton Hardy had disappeared. Early the next morning, a thick-set, broad-shouldered young man presented himself at the front door of the Hardy home and said he had something to tell them. Miss Hardy invited them to step inside, and he stood in the hall, nervously twisting a cap in his hand. As Frank and Joe appeared, the man introduced himself as Sam Bates. I'm a truck driver, he told them. The reason I came around to see you is because I heard you were looking for Mr. Hardy. I might be able to help you.